welcome to Rising. Another day, another dollar, but here we are to bring you the news. Hello, Brianna.
Hello, Robbie.
How's it going?
It's going well. I have some news from the other Robert in my life.
Oh, okay. Why don't you lay it on us?
Well, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., of course, joined Elon Musk for a Twitter Spaces discussion yesterday about his campaign for president. The New York Times characterized the discussion as follows, quote, Robert Kennedy Jr. with Musk pushes right-wing ideas and misinformation. Mr. Kennedy, a long-shot Democratic presidential candidate with surprisingly high polling numbers, said he wanted to close the Mexican border and attributed the rise of mass shootings to pharmaceutical drugs. The Times in particular took issue with Kennedy's characterization of President Biden as a warmonger. Quote, Mr. Kennedy spent 9 uninterrupted minutes attacking Mr. Biden as a warmonger and claimed that their party was under the control of the pharmaceutical industry. I think the Democratic Party became the party of war, Mr. Kennedy said. I attribute that directly to President Biden. He added, he has always been in favor of a very bellicose, pugnacious, and aggressive foreign policy, and he believes that violence is a legitimate political tool for achieving America's objectives abroad.
I wonder which part of that was supposed to be misinformation. Journalist Glenn Greenwald weighed in on what he called a hit piece by the Times. Quote, the New York Times glossary, misinformation, words spoken by a critic of the Democratic Party establishment. Right-wing, one who is a critic of the Democratic Party establishment. Of course, corporate outlets will attack all Biden opponents, but this New York Times hit piece on RFK Jr. is just dumb. He continued, how dare RFK Jr. characterize Joe Biden, someone who has vehemently supported every U.S. war for decades, was a key Senate advocate of the war in Iraq, and is flooding Ukraine with advanced weaponry, of being a warmonger. Why, this is misinformation. Censor it. I think Glenn is getting at something very real here, which is that, we'll get into the full range of things that were discussed in this Twitter Spaces. There are many points of policy where I'm not a Democrat, where I disagree very much with where RFK Jr. is coming from, but I'm having a hard time agreeing with this framing by mainstream people, by the New York Times, that he is some uniquely duplicitous liar. The criticisms he's making of the Democratic Party with respect to how it has changed its views on free speech, the mainstream elites coming out against free speech, being the party, the consensus, the group that supports war, that supports neoconservatism, that's all true. That's all a trajectory change that has taken place over the last 15 years. It's true.
Of all the things to pick up and criticize out of that 2 hours Twitter Spaces, it's bizarre that they would hop on that particular bandwagon. I mean, not only did he say a lot of true things about the origin of the war in Ukraine, the provocation of Biden and Biden as VP under Barack Obama in the region. He talked about the way that the Democratic Party became aligned over time with the pharmaceutical industry. He talked about how Obama, to pass Obamacare, had to make this trade-off to get votes on board. And he basically threw the American people under the bus by saying we can't negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry. And at that point, the Democratic Party pivoted to be the party that took more money from the pharmaceutical industry as the Republicans. He showed a really interesting and comprehensive understanding of some of the reasons for bias in the media. He talked about how absurd it is to have a General Dynamic, military companies advertising during Morning Joe, and how that incentive there is not because, parents prepping their kids for school and watching the news are buying defense missiles, but because they want to be able to control the narrative, and the same thing happening in the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, there was so much truth in what he said. At the same time, I do think that the format, again, was awkward. There was that maybe 30 minutes of obsequiousness up top where it was basically RFK Jr.
praising
interviewing Musk, not the other way around.
Yeah, at one point Elon Musk said, okay, I think the people listening probably want to hear more about you and your policy views and your run.
Exactly, especially because Musk wasn't a particularly interesting interview, especially even compared to RFK Jr. He's just a much less thoughtful and articulate person. But there was a lot of over-the-top praising, in my subjective opinion, of Elon Musk in the platform as a free speech portal. I think he did a really great job talking about the values of free speech and the way the ACLU has failed to hold up the values of his youth that were very accurate, but there was also a failure to criticize the way that Twitter has similarly betrayed its own promises.
And I wondered if the way RFK Jr. was framing what Elon has done on Twitter as this almost sacrifice Elon has made, buying it for $44 billion.
Yeah.
It's only worth like $15 billion now because of the advertisers leaving it, and him saying like you've made this true like financial hit to defend free speech, and I don't know if Elon sees it that way, right? I think he still aspires to make it a profitable enterprise, right? Not just I don't think he planned to just like lose $30 billion to defend free speech. I mean, that's almost, Twitter is a place for elite discourse. It's not like everyone in the world is on Twitter.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe it would be, if you're going to spend $30 billion to just like give it away in order to prop up free speech, I don't know that Twitter was the right even approach to do that. But I don't think that's actually what Elon wants to do. He wants to build a profitable place where there's less bias and there's more free speech. But this is going to involve and make money. It's going to involve compromises that maybe he didn't consider.
But he had to be forced, remember, into buying Twitter because part of the issue was when he looked under the hood ostensibly and saw the subscriber numbers, he didn't think it was going to be profitable or advantageous, whatever the reason. I think that's a perfectly legitimate problem to have with the company as you're buying it. But he didn't say, I'm going to do it anyway because I believe in free speech and justice. He then had to be strong-armed into completing the deal. Moreover, he's just hired this new Twitter CEO, which has gotten a lot of criticism from his supporters because she is from an establishment news organization, and the incentive behind hiring her seems to be to gin up advertisers again. So there's this dissonance between critiquing advertisers, the nature of these businesses that depend on advertising dollars, the negative influence on speech that the advertisers can have, but also very much trying to still keep them within your wheelhouse and to profit off of that structure. Now, there are a couple of other parts of this interview that went viral.
Let's get to the actual meat of what he said on the pharmaceutical industry, guns and mass shooting. So. I don't agree with. He very strongly linked mass shootings in the country to Prozac. So I think it is totally legitimate to criticize the over-medication of, in particular, young people that has occurred over the last several decades. We can look at self-reported rates of mental health and suicide and attempts among young people, and they have not improved over time. They've gotten a lot worse, in fact, over the same time period where there's more young people taking antidepressants and that kind of thing. I think it is perfectly legitimate to question whether all of this has been necessarily good for young people, whether there is a desire among policymakers or doctors in coordination with the pharmaceutical industry to just write prescriptions for mood altering things for young people and say that has this actually done them a lot of good if you look at that. So I think that's totally fair. I don't think it's quite fair to say that that's the obvious cause of like mass shootings in the country. But the school shootings, like not all of those people were on antidepressants, a lot of them.
Of course not. And look, his answer was sort of all over the place. He referred to himself as like a constitutional absolutist. He said, I'm not going to take guns away because he understands what gun culture is and how polarizing that would be.
But then he said he wants TSA-style airport security for schools.
Right. He says, we have to stop the killings in the school. He also says, my family has been personally very much affected by gun violence for obvious reasons.
Right.
So he seemed to be, the California guy in him seemed to come out. Like, I understand, what it felt like was if I had my druthers, yes, we wouldn't have guns. But I understand that people have an investment in the Constitution. I think the constitutional principles are important, and I understand that gun culture is important.
And that's all fine. I totally a view that I think makes sense as a policy
what
position.
He ended up doing was, and he does this frequently, he explained what the dividing lines are and what the tension lines are without necessarily offering up a solution. Now, in the conversation about the border, it was a little different. He very much did take a strong stand saying that we need to shut down the border. He said in earlier conversations that, in an earlier interview, I think with Krista Ball, that he looked to the Israeli model of border patrol as what we should implement in America, which rankled a lot of his left audience. I'm sure it satisfied the more right-leaning audience that was on the Twitter Spaces, or at least invited to speak on the Twitter Spaces. But I think these kinds of interviews are going to very quickly reshape who constitutes his particular audience. The less he said, the more he could be more things to all people. But between this, the whole colloquy about Israel that we talked about yesterday, I don't know that those numbers that he's getting right now are going to hold unless he is able to frankly expand the more conservative-leaning part of the populace, and whether or not those people are going to be sufficiently concentrated in states with open primaries that can actually vote for him is a really difficult question he's going to have to wrangle with.
You did see this a little bit in the New York Times piece where they're trying to grapple with, they have to grapple with the fact that he has very impressive numbers, and they acknowledge that, and then they don't explain why that is, and they're just kind of
like, he's a long shot at 20%, like basically polling the same as DeSantis.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. But he continues to do the media circle. We're looking forward to interviewing him some point on this show in the coming weeks, and we'll continue to talk about his electoral prospects and the whole rest of the gang. More Rising right after this.